I don't know what to credit it to as much as I had a hunger to tell stories. I'm very much somebody who does not take anything for granted. So even when Grey's had become really successful, my feeling was this could go away at any moment. I better make another show.
Hello and welcome to The New Conversation. I'm Dwight McBride, president of The New School. The New Conversation is a series where I converse with distinguished thinkers, creators, and doers about their work, their life experiences, and their perspectives on some of the most important issues of our time. Today's guest is none other than Shonda Rhimes, one of the most admired and prolific screenwriters and producers working today. She's the genius behind television series like Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, and Bridgerton, the founder of digital media company Shondaland, and one of the co-founders of Time's Up. She's an inspiration to so many of us here at the New School, and I'm thrilled to have her here with us today. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Well, listen, I'm going to start with the question I ask everyone who sits in this seat in this series, and that is, when did you know that you wanted to work in film and television?
I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was very clear. I was dictating stories into tape recorders when I was 3 and trying to get my mom to type them up. But I don't know, I thought I was going to be a novelist. It never occurred to me. I wanted to be Toni Morrison. That was like my thing. I was going to be this deep, soulful, amazing novelist. But, you know, Toni Morrison's already Toni Morrison, number one. But as well, you know, it wasn't until I got out of college and was sort of wandering around, like feeling a little bit lost, not sure how to be a writer, not sure what kinds of jobs there were for writers. And my parents are academics, and they very much were like, please go to graduate school. Which, you know, I get that. And I read an article that said it was harder to get into USC Film School than it was to get into Harvard Law School. And I thought, well, there's writing there, you know, and Spike Lee was huge at that moment. And I thought, well, I'll go to film school. And sort of went on impulse, really.
Wow.
And even then I thought I was going to write movies. And then while I was there, I really started to enjoy the process and really discovered how much I loved it. And then after I became a mom, it was really about, you never leave the house, so you're watching television. And I realized that television was where all the good character development was happening. You know, movies, it's short, it has to happen in a certain amount of time, but you could develop a character on television for years. And that was interesting to me.
Interesting. And were there any early influences for you in that way?
You know, as a child, growing up with academics, we didn't watch a ton of television.
Yeah.
But I did, you know, I was one of those kids who was there every week in front of watching Good Times with my family. And then, you know, there were other shows. Like I watched a lot of really old television, like Mary Tyler Moore and The Dick Van Dyke Show. I watched all of that, as well as, you know, All in the Family. The Norman Lear universe was really interesting to me back then.
Your early television days sound a lot like my own. I think we share a generation in that regard. Listen, you've spoken about your parents, both of whom were in academia. Tell me a little bit about growing up in the house of two academics, and what kind of impact do you think that's had on your career and your development?
You know, it was a very, I would say, like bookish house, if that makes sense. Books were everywhere. I don't know, there's sort of a thing like books are your friends, you don't get rid of them. So we just had a house filled with books. My parents played a lot of chess together. But for me, I think the influence was my dad was already in academia. My mom went to college and then got her PhD while I was in high school and then college. So it was this really interesting thing of she was an active student for so much of my formative youth. And she loved it. Like she really loved it. And I loved it. And so we talked about it a lot. And for me, getting to study things and delve into different worlds was always really interesting. And it's what's turned up in my writing, really.
Yeah. Well, it can easily be said in terms of your writing that you have shaped, in a very short span of time, you've shaped the culture of television. And I don't even think there's ever been another writer or showrunner who's literally taken over an entire evening of television, as you did back with ABC on Thursday nights. That was my night to watch TV. I loved every single program on that evening. Tell me, you know, what do you credit that kind of success with in that moment? Because it really was a new moment. And for so many of us, the pride of seeing a Black woman doing this work in that moment, what do you credit your success with in that moment?
Oh, wow. First, I don't think I was the only one. I think Aaron Spelling did it before me with Love Boat and Fantasy Island and all those Saturday night shows that were on in the 70s. But, for me, I don't know what to credit it to as much as I had a hunger to tell stories. I'm very much somebody who does not take anything for granted. So even when Grey's had become really successful, my feeling was this could go away at any moment, I better make another show. This could go away at any moment, I better make another show. So I was always working really hard to stay where I was. And I don't have the privilege of being somebody who takes things for granted. And so for me, a lot of my hard work was about that. Like, you just don't know when something's going to go away. I was passionate about the stories I was telling. I was passionate about the work we did. I don't know that I would have made so many shows at once if it hadn't been for that fact that I felt like, you're in a tenuous position. You just don't know when this is going to end.
Interesting. Because I don't think most people would look at Shonda Rhimes and think of her as tenuous, right? But I get it. It makes a whole lot of sense. It all depends on the context in which you're working. And I totally get that, yeah.
It took a long time for me to feel successful. Like somebody asked me when, and this is truly the truth. I was being inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame by Oprah Winfrey. And in that moment, I thought, oh, I can relax a little bit. Like, it's okay. I'm here. It took a long time for me to feel like that.
Well, you mentioned Grey's, and I want to talk because, as I said, I'm a full-on Shonda fanatic. So I've been watching Grey's I think we're in season 19 now of Grey's.
Yeah.
And so where did that storyline come from? What was the inspiration, the origin of it? And did you ever anticipate that it would be this successful and on for this long?
So Grey's came up because I had written a pilot once, and that pilot was about war correspondents, and it was about really amazing competitive women who loved their job and were reporting on wars. Well, we went to war basically around that time, and I wrote a pilot, I think that was like a $30 million pilot. It was so expensive to shoot. There was no way we were going to ever shoot it because I'd never written television before. And so the next year pilot season rolled around, which was, how shows got on the air. I asked somebody, like, Bob Iger is the chairman of Disney, what does he want? And they said he really wants a medical show. I happen to be a surgery junkie. Like, I would watch all those surgeries back when TLC, like, showed surgeries all the time. And I thought it was a really interesting concept. And I came at it from the same point of view I would come at anything new, which was I didn't know anything. So I was going to write about characters who also didn't know anything going into this world. They were interns, and they were women, and they were really competitive, and they were very unapologetic, and they were the kind of women that I hadn't really been seeing on TV. Like, I wanted to watch women who were like the women I knew. And so that was really where Grey's came from, like the medical thing combined with the idea that I wanted to see women who were fully rounded. I mean, up until then, like, women were nice, very nice, and they weren't they were defined by their motherhood or their wifehood. They weren't defined by what they did exactly. And if they were, they sort of made that feel like it was a flaw.
Actually, as you say that, I think about the women characters that you've developed across many of your shows have that in common, that they are more fully drawn as humans, as people. They're not, there's not a one note to them in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that that's possible for, nobody real is one note. So it was really interesting to me to build these characters that really feel human to me.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about some of your shows and your latest release, of course, Queen Charlotte, which everyone is completely gaga over, including myself. And this is a part of the Bridgerton storyline for those people who may be living under a rock and don't know about the series. You are credited or a credited writer for 5 of the 6 scripts in that series. And the New Yorker wrote, and I quote, "There's a distinct Shonda-ness to the dialogue." Was that storyline more special to you? And what do you think the New Yorker is pointing to when they talk about the Shonda-ness of the dialogue?
I've been asked about this in similar ways before about the dialogue, and I've almost like put my fingers in my ears and been like, because I don't want to hear it. Because the minute I start examining my dialogue, I think it's over. So I don't know what it is. I purposely have like stayed away from it because I don't notice a pattern or think that it's anything, but everybody else does. And I feel like if I knew what the pattern was, I wouldn't be able to do it anymore.
Well, then I won't tell you what my thoughts are. Another time, I'll leave that off camera as well. Is there something that's different to you about writing these kinds of romances compared to some of the previous hits like Scandal or How to Get Away with Murder? Does this feel different?
Well, you know what's interesting is I don't think of it as a romance. I know
Uh-huh.
everybody else does, but to me, it's this really powerful story of women stepping into their own power and manipulating the worlds around them that exist only for men to suit them as women. And in the midst of all this, there's this love story, which is a lot about what Scandal's about, really. It's the same thing, women stepping into their own power, manipulating the world around them to fit and suit them for their power. And then in the middle of it all, there's a love story. I never really thought of it that particularly before, but when people started calling this a romance, I started really thinking about that, because I do believe Bridgerton is romance. It's pure romance. That
Yeah.
was not my intention necessarily when writing this story.
So your shows have always included diverse cast and storylines, and this is something people have talked about a lot. You've explored stories from the perspective of women, queerness, people of color, and while much of that probably shouldn't feel groundbreaking today, it still is groundbreaking, and that says a lot about the times in which we live. I want to talk a little bit about that and how much intention there is in those the kinds of stories and the kinds of characters that you put in those stories.
You know, I'm not going to tell stories that don't include me. So
Yeah.
I'm going to want to see people of color on screen. I'm not going to tell stories that don't include the world as I know it. You know, to suggest that we're not going to tell stories from the perspective of queer people makes no sense to me. The world is full of them, and they all have wonderful stories to tell that are not just about being queer. The same way when you have people of color on screen, a lot of times they're relegated to a place where they're telling stories just about being a person of color. I really want to see rounded three-dimensional people owning and living in their world. And to me, it felt natural. It doesn't feel like I'm doing anything special. I was sort of stunned when I wrote people of color as they are, and people were shocked at the fact that we were showing rounded three-dimensional characters. That says more about what's wrong with television than anything. Everybody is a three-dimensional character. Everybody has, you know, flaws and gifts and problems and conflicts, and I want to watch it all. You know, it's very hard to be, and I've talked to a lot of actors about this, it's very hard to be the only person of color acting in a show. Because you really are then tokenized in a way that you weren't intending, and perhaps the people creating the show weren't intending, but it happens. Suddenly you represent all people of color.
Yeah.
And my thing is that's not how the world works. You know, that's a very Eurocentric perspective to come at the world from, and I don't see the world from that perspective.
I love that. Love that. The Bridgerton series also brings together characters across and actors across color into roles that they've historically not had access to. And it feels like exploring almost a kind of new direction of race in historical fiction. It's very clear when you're watching the show that race is, of course, not absent, and that it's, in fact, not really something that a term people use, and it irks me, colorblind casting, because I don't think that's what it is, as some have referred to it. But how do you feel like that's been received? And again, what kind of intention is there, if there is, for you behind this world of casting and the way in which it works for you as a writer?
It's very intentional. I mean, I'm wasn't the creator of Bridgerton, but I was the executive producer, and I'd found those books, and it was really important to me that when we cast that show, that we were casting it in a way that made sense for the world. So that when we started to talk about how do we incorporate people of color into this world, that's how we started off with the idea of Queen Charlotte being a woman of color. That really gave us the way in to talk about how this world could exist. I wanted it to be logical. I do not believe in colorblind casting. I think it's really naive of anybody to think that they can be blind about color. We call it color conscious casting, but to me it's simply, that's how I'm going to cast a show anyway. It's not a specific mandate that I have to put out. There's no other way to do it, you know. So to me it felt very obvious that we would do that, and then figuring out who the families were and how they were going to line up, it was exciting, because if you notice, Queen Charlotte, Lady Danbury, the Duke, those were the most powerful people in town. They all ended up being people of color because of the reasons of how we were telling that story.
I love that about the story too, and I'd love on another occasion to be able to plumb the depths of that a bit further, because I'm fascinated by seeing those characters represented in that way in this world. but yet still contending with, right, the precarity of their circumstances in the world of Queen Charlotte as well, which you don't shy away from either.
No, I really wanted to dive into that. I mean, if you,
Yeah,
the explanation that we give in Bridgerton is that the love of Queen Charlotte and King George is what made this new society possible, which
yeah,
sounds amazing. And I wanted to find a way into that that showed how that at least began. So to have
yeah,
this woman of color step into a world where she suddenly discovers she's very other and how that works, and to just face it head on, there was no reason to be coy about it.
yeah, yeah,
That was important to me. And then to create, I called it a lot of performative integration. That's what they were doing. It was very political and just for show. They hadn't really gotten that far by the time even the first Queen Charlotte series ends. Maybe it's the first, it might be the only. By the time Queen Charlotte ends. And then, but that there's a start there. And that was important to me. I didn't want to solve it so easily, but I didn't want it to also be something that we glossed over.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about a bit more personally about family and your personal life a bit. You wrote a memoir in 2015, and I listened to an interview. I think it may have been on NPR. This was, of course, a while ago, when you talked about, and I'm blanking on the title, and I didn't write it down, but it was like the year of saying yes. Can you remind me
The year of yes.
The year of yes, that's right. And I love the idea because it was just instead of saying no to things that you routinely say no to, what would it look like if you took a year and said yes to all of those things? So I love the idea, love the concept, loved hearing you talk about it. Tell me this, was it different writing? And I say this as a literature nerd myself. Was it different writing for the page and words that you knew were going to be in dialogue with a reader versus writing for the screen? Or were there similarities that surprised you? I'm just curious about that.
It was a very different writing experience in general, just because it was so personal, number one.
Yeah.
But also, here's the similarity. I made it a goal for myself that I needed to be as honest with my readers as my characters were with their viewers. So I tried really hard to not self-censor and to really just honestly put it out there, versus, and I think that's a big thing for story anyway. I'm always trying to make sure that everything feels authentic and is real, for my characters. I wanted the same for my readers to get to see from me. And I think that that's the difference in writing a lot of shows. Some people aren't writing for authenticity, they're writing for plot. And I was definitely, on both occasions, I wasn't writing for plot. I was just writing to show this sort of side of myself, I think. And it was an amazing experience. I mean, I was a very closed person. I was an introvert. I was incredibly shy. I was not doing a lot. I was basically had my head down. I was doing nothing but working. And this experience truly changed my life in so many ways that I can't even begin to, it still continues to change my life now.
Yeah. Well, I know you have 3 daughters.
Yes.
And how would you talk about the influence that the work you put into the world has created maybe a different world for them, different possibilities for them?
I mean, it's hard. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I have an almost 21-year-old, and the almost 21-year-old has never seen my shows until recently. I mean, think about it. Like, your mom's writing about all of this stuff.
Well, okay, yeah. Now that I think about it, when I put it in context, makes sense. Got it.
And all
Got
her
it.
friends are binge watching it. I take it as a compliment that she was not interested. You know what I mean? I think that was a good thing. But for me, I feel like one of the things that's most important is, they grew up with a mother who had a big job and was very powerful in my job and gave them the example of being very comfortable being powerful in that space. Mm-hmm. They also, the things my characters say are things that they grew up hearing in the home anyway. So, I have little girls who say things like, I say, why are princesses not a good idea? And they say things like, well, they don't have jobs. Only Tinkerbell has a job, Mom. Like, we get it. But putting that world out there where they can see themselves is huge. And every time, something comes out, The Little Mermaid came out this weekend. My girls were right there. Like, something comes out where they can see themselves reflected. It's powerful and important. And I hope it is powerful and important for other women and other families too.
And the last question I'll ask today is really one for our students. I always like to ask every guest I have on the program this too. There are a lot of students who, of course, especially at the new school, look up to you and the kind of work you do. There are many of them who aspire to be versions of you and to work in the industry that you work in. What would be your advice to students, both who may be thinking about entertainment as a career, and also more generally, if there's something that you'd like to say to young people in this moment, this very unusual and unsettling political moment that we're all navigating right now as well?
It is a really unsettling time. And I think
Yeah.
the thing that might have helped me best, obviously there's discipline. There's making sure you're writing every day if you want to be a writer. There's making sure that you're practicing whatever art you want to practice on a regular basis so that that muscle stays active and ready to go. But to me, like, the thing that has helped me the most is the idea that I belong in any room I'm in.
Yeah.
I think that's really important to remember, that you belong in any room you're in. If you've gotten into that room, you belong there. Because there's so many times when you get into rooms and people treat you like you don't belong. And then you begin to feel like you don't belong, so you act like you don't belong. And I think it's important to sort of stake your flag and understand that if you've been given this opportunity, that opportunity is yours because you earned it. And if you feel lucky for having it, that's great, but don't let that be the thing that drives you forward. Your work is what gets you someplace. And when you get somewhere, don't waste the opportunity. Just don't. There's not a lot of them that come around, especially right now.
Absolutely. And one of the things I couldn't agree more, because I think people like us, when we get into these rooms, we sometimes do feel lucky. We sometimes do feel as if we have to be careful and tread lightly.
Yes.
And I think that is really the wrong attitude to have when we enter these spaces. Toni Morrison talked about this in a commencement speech I quote often: taking time to both think and dream when you come into these new spaces of power, but also understanding that you have the responsibility to act, and not just for yourself, but on behalf of others, and making sure that you're making room for others to enter these spaces.
Right.
So I see that in you. I see it in your career. It's one of the things that I think so many of us are inspired by. So thank you.
No, thank you. You just never want to be the last person to enter one of those spaces. You want to make sure that there are people coming behind you, always.
Shonda, thank you so much. This has been an absolute and sheer delight. I've been looking forward to it for a long time, so thank you.
I love talking to you. This was great.